Book 2, Chapter 1, page 71, The Hired Girls. I had been living with my grandfather for nearly 3 years when he decided to move to Black Hawk. He and grandmother were getting old for the heavy work of a farm, and as I was now 13, they thought I ought to be going to school. Accordingly, our homestead was rented to that good woman, the widow Stevens, and her bachelor brother, and we bought Preacher White's house at the north end of Black Hawk. This was the first townhouse one passed driving in from the farm, a landmark which told country people their long ride was over. We were to move to Black Hawk in March, and as soon as grandfather had fixed the date, he let Jake and Otto know of his intention. Otto said he would not be likely to find another place that suited him so well, that he was tired of farming and thought he would go back to what he called the Wild West. Jake Marple, lured by Otto's stories of adventure, decided to go with him. We did our best to dissuade Jake. He was so handicapped by illiteracy and by his trusting disposition that he would be an easy prey to sharpers. Grandmother begged him to stay among kindly Christian people where he was known, but there was no reasoning with him. He wanted to be a prospector. He thought a silver mine was waiting for him in Colorado. Jake and Otto served us to the last. They moved us into town, put down the carpets in our new house, made shelves and cupboards for grandmother's kitchen, and seemed loath to leave us. But at last they went without warning. Those two fellows had been faithful to us through sun and storm, had given us things that cannot be bought in any market in the world. With me they had been like older brothers. They had restrained their speech and manners out of care for me, and given me so much good comradeship. Now they got on the westbound train one morning in their Sunday clothes with their oilcloth valises, and I never saw them again. Months afterward, we got a card from Otto, saying that Jake had been down with mountain fever, but now they were both working in the Yankee Girl mine, and were doing well. I wrote to them at that address, but my letter was returned to me unclaimed. After that, we never heard from them. Black Hawk, the new world in which we had come to live, was a clean, well-planted little prairie town with white fences and good green yards about the dwellings, wide, dusty streets, and shapely little trees growing along the wooden sidewalks. In the center of the town, there were 2 rows of new brick store buildings, a brick schoolhouse, the courthouse, and 4 white churches. Our own house looked down over the town, and from our upstairs windows we could see the winding lane of the river bluffs, 2 miles south of us. That river was to be my compensation for the lost freedom of the farming country. We came to Black Hawk in March, and by the end of April we felt like town people. Grandfather was a deacon in the new Baptist church. Grandmother was busy with church suppers and missionary societies, and I was quite another boy, or thought I was. Suddenly, put down among boys of my own age, I found I had a great deal to learn. Before the spring term of school was over, I could fight, play keeps, tease the little girls, and use forbidden words as well as any boy in my class. I was restrained from utter savagery only by the fact that Mrs. Harling, our nearest neighbor, kept an eye on me, and if my behavior went beyond certain bounds, I was not permitted to come into her yard or to play with her jolly children. We saw more of our country neighbors now than when we lived on the farm. Our house was a convenient stopping place for them. We had a big barn where the farmers could put up their teams, and their womenfolk more often accompanied them now that they could stay with us for dinner and rest and set their bonnets right before they went shopping. The more our house was like a country hotel, the better I liked it. I was glad when I came home from school at noon to see a farm wagon standing in the backyard, and I was always ready to run downtown to get beefsteak or baker's bread for unexpected company. All through that first spring and summer, I kept hoping that Ambrose would bring Antonia and Yulka to see our new house. I wanted to show them our red plush furniture and the trumpet-blowing cherubs the German paper hanger had put on our parlor ceiling. When Ambrose came to town, however, he came alone, and though he put his horses in our barn, he would never stay for dinner, or tell us anything about his mother and sisters. If we ran out and questioned him as he was slipping through the yard, he would merely work his shoulders about in his coat and say, "They all right, I guess." Mrs. Stevens, who now lived on our farm, grew as fond of Antonia as we had been, and always brought us news of her. All through the wheat season, she told us, Ambrose hired his sister out like a man, and she went from farm to farm, binding sheaves or working with the thrashers. The farmers liked her and were kind to her, said they would rather have her for a hand than Ambrose. When fall came, she was to husk corn for the neighbors until Christmas, as she had done the year before, but grandmother saved her from this by getting her a place to work with our neighbors, the Harlings. Chapter 2. Grandmother often said that if she had to live in town, she thanked God she lived next to the Harlings. They had been farming people like ourselves, and their place was like a little farm, with a big barn and a garden, and an orchard and grazing lots, even a windmill. The Harlings were Norwegians, and Mrs. Harling had lived in Christiania until she was 10 years old. Her husband was born in Minnesota. He was a grain merchant and cattle buyer and was generally considered the most enterprising businessman in our county. He controlled a line of grain elevators in the little towns along the railroad to the west of us, and was away from home a great deal. In his absence, his wife was the head of the household. Mrs. Harling was short and square and sturdy-looking, like her house. Every inch of her was charged with energy, and made itself felt the moment she entered a room. Her face was rosy and solid, with bright, twinkling eyes and a stubborn little chin. She was quick to anger, quick to laughter, and jolly from the depths of her soul. How well I remember her laugh. It had in it the same sudden recognition that flashed into her eyes, was a burst of humor, short and intelligent. Her rapid footsteps shook her own floors, and she routed lassitude and indifference wherever she came. She could not be negative or perfunctory about anything. Her enthusiasm and her violent likes and dislikes asserted themselves in all the everyday occupations of life. Wash day was interesting and never dreary at the Harlings. Preserving time was a prolonged festival, and house cleaning was like a revolution. When Mrs. Harling made garden that spring, we could feel the stir of her undertaking through the willow hedge that separated our place from hers. 3 of the Harling children were near me in age. Charlie, the only son, they had lost an older boy, was 16. Julia, who was known as the musical one, was 14 when I was, and Sally, the tomboy with short hair, was a year younger. She was nearly as strong as I, and uncannily clever at all boys' sports. Sally was a wild thing, with sunburned yellow hair, bobbed about her ears, and a brown skin, for she never wore a hat. She raced all over town on one roller skate, often cheated at keeps, but was such a quick shot one couldn't catch her at it. The grown-up daughter, Frances, was a very important person in our world. She was her father's chief clerk, and virtually managed his Black Hawk office during his frequent absences. Because of her unusual business ability, he was stern and exacting with her. He paid her a good salary, but she had few holidays and never got away from her responsibilities. Even on Sundays, she went to the office to open the mail and read the markets. With Charlie, she was not interested in business, but was already preparing for Annapolis. Mr. Harling was very indulgent, bought him guns and tools and electric batteries, and never asked what he did with them. Frances was dark like her father and quite as tall. In winter, she wore a sealskin coat and cap, and she and Mr. Harling used to walk home together in the evening, talking about grain cars and cattle like 2 men. Sometimes she came over to see grandfather after supper, and her visits flattered him. More than once they put their wits together to rescue some unfortunate farmer from the clutches of Wick Cutter, the Black Hawk moneylender. Grandfather and Francis Harling was as good a judge of credits as any banker in the county. The 2 or 3 men who had tried to take advantage of her in a deal acquired celebrity by their defeat. She knew every farmer for miles about, how much land he had under cultivation, how many cattle he was feeding, what his liabilities were. Her interest in these people was more than a business interest. She carried them all in her mind as if they were characters in a book or a play. When Frances drove out into the country on business, she would go miles out of her way to call on some of the old people, or to see the women who seldom got to town. She was quick at understanding the grandmothers who spoke no English, and the most reticent and distrustful of them would tell her their story without realizing they were doing so. She went to country funerals and weddings in all weathers. A farmer's daughter who was to be married could count on a wedding present from Frances Harling. In August, the Harlings' Danish cook had to leave them. Grandmother entreated them to try Antonia. She cornered Ambrose the next time he came to town and pointed out to him that any connection with Christian Harling would strengthen his credit and be of advantage to him. One Sunday, Mrs. Harling took the long ride out to the Shimerdas with Frances. She said she wanted to see what the girl came from, and to have a clear understanding with her mother. I was in our yard when they came driving home just before sunset. They laughed and waved to me as they passed, and I could see they were in great good humor. After supper, when grandfather set off to church, Grandmother and I took my shortcut through the willow hedge and went over to hear about the visit to the Shimerdas. We found Mrs. Harling with Charlie and Sally on the front porch resting after her hard drive. Julia was in the hammock. She was fond of repose, and Frances was at the piano, playing without a light, and talking to her mother through the open window. Mrs. Harling laughed when she saw us coming. "I expect you left your dishes on the table tonight, Mrs. Burden," she called. Frances shut the piano and came out to join us. They had liked Antonia from their first glimpse of her, felt they knew exactly what kind of girl she was. As for Mrs. Shimerda, they found her very amusing. Mrs. Harling chuckled whenever she spoke of her. "I expect I am more at home with that sort of bird than you are, Mrs. Burden. They are a pair, Ambrose and that old woman." They had had a long argument with Ambrose about Antonia's allowance for clothes and pocket money. It was his plan that every cent of his sister's wages should be paid over to him each month, and he would provide her with such clothing as he thought necessary. When Mrs. Harling told him firmly that she would keep $50 a year for Antonia's own use, he declared they wanted to take his sister to town and dress her up and make a fool of her. Mrs. Harling gave us a lively account of Ambrose's behavior throughout the interview, how he kept jumping up and putting on his cap as if he were through with the whole business, and how his mother tweaked his coat tail and prompted him in Bohemian. Mrs. Harling finally agreed to pay $3 a week for Antonia's services, good wages in those days, and to keep her in shoes. There had been hot dispute about the shoes, Mrs. Shimerda finally saying persuasively that she would send Mrs. Harling 3 fat geese every year to make even. Ambrose was to bring his sister to town next Saturday. "She'll be awkward and rough at first, like enough," Grandmother said anxiously, "but unless she's been spoiled by the hard life she's led, she has it in her to be a real helpful girl." Mrs. Harling laughed her quick, decisive laugh. "Oh, I'm not worried, Mrs. Burden. I can bring something out of that girl. She's barely 17, not too old to learn new ways. She's good-looking, too," she added warmly. Frances turned to Grandmother. "Oh, yes, Mrs. Burden, you didn't tell us that. She was working in the garden when we got there, and barefoot and ragged, but she has such fine brown legs and arms and splendid color in her cheeks, like those big dark red plums." We were pleased at this praise. Grandmother spoke feelingly. "When she first came to this country, Frances, and had that genteel old man to watch over her, she was as pretty a girl as ever I saw. But dear me, what a life she's led out in the fields with those rough thrashers. Things would have been very different with poor Antonia if her father had lived." The Harlings begged us to tell them about Mr. Shimerda's death and the big snowstorm. By the time we saw Grandfather coming home from church, we had told them pretty much all we knew of the Shimerdas. "The girl will be happy here, and she'll forget those things," said Mrs. Harling confidently, as we rose to take our leave. On Saturday, Chapter 3. On Saturday, Ambrose drove up to the back gate, and Antonia jumped down from the wagon and ran into our kitchen just as she used to do. She was wearing shoes and stockings and was breathless and excited. She gave me a playful shake by the shoulders. "You ain't forget about me, Jim?" Grandmother kissed her. "God bless you, child. Now you've come, you must try to do right and be a credit to us." Antonia looked eagerly about the house and admired everything. "Maybe I be the kind of girl you like better, now I come to town," she suggested hopefully. How good it was to have Antonia near us again, to see her every day and almost every night. Her greatest fault, Mrs. Harling found, was that she so often stopped her work and fell to playing with the children. She would race about the orchard with us, or take sides in our hay fights in the barn, or be the old bear that came down from the mountain and carried off Nina. Tony learned English so quickly that by the time school began she could speak as well as any of us. I was jealous of Tony's admiration for Charlie Harling. Because he was always first in his classes at school and could mend the water pipes or the doorbell and take the clock to pieces, she seemed to think him a sort of prince. Nothing that Charlie wanted was too much trouble for her. She loved to put up lunches for him when he went hunting, to mend his ball gloves and sew buttons on his student coat, baked the kind of nut cake he liked, and fed his setter dog when he was away on trips with his father. Antonia had made herself cloth working slippers out of Mr. Harling's old coats, and in these she went padding about after Charlie, fairly panting with eagerness to please him. Next to Charlie, I think she loved Nina best. Nina was only 6, and she was rather more complex than the other children. She was fanciful, had all sorts of unspoken preferences, and was easily offended. At the slightest disappointment or displeasure, her velvety brown eyes filled with tears, and she would lift her chin and walk silently away. If we ran after her and tried to appease her, it did no good. She walked on unmollified. I used to think that no eyes in the world could grow so large or hold so many tears as Nina's. Mrs. Harling and Antonia invariably took her part. We were never given a chance to explain. The charge was simply, "You have made Nina cry. Now Jimmy can go home, and Sally must get her arithmetic." I liked Nina, too. She was so quaint and unexpected, and her eyes were lovely, but I often wanted to shake her. We had jolly evenings at the Harlings when the father was away. If he was at home, the children had to go to bed early, or they came over to my house to play. Mr. Harling not only demanded a quiet house, he demanded all his wife's attention. He used to take her away to their room in the West L and talk over his business with her all evening. Though we did not realize it then, Mrs. Harling was our audience when we played, and we always looked to her for suggestions. Nothing flattered one like her quick laugh. Mr. Harling had a desk in his bedroom and his own easy chair by the window, in which no one else ever sat. On the nights when he was at home, I could see his shadow on the blind, and it seemed to me an arrogant shadow. Mrs. Harling paid no heed to anyone else if he was there. Before he went to bed, she always got him a lunch of smoked salmon or anchovies and beer. He kept an alcohol lamp in his room and a French coffee pot, and his wife made coffee for him at any hour of the night he happened to want it. Most Blackhawk fathers had no personal habits outside their domestic ones. They paid the bills, pushed the baby carriage after office hours, moved the sprinkler about over the lawn, and took the family driving on Sunday. Mr. Harling, therefore, seemed to me autocratic and imperial in his ways. He walked, talked, put on his gloves, shook hands, like a man who felt that he had power. He was not tall, but he carried his head so haughtily that he looked a commanding figure, and there was something daring and challenging in his eyes. I used to imagine that the nobles, of whom Antonia was always talking, probably looked very much like Christian Harling, wore caped overcoats like his, and just such a glittering diamond upon his little finger. Except when the father was at home, the Harling house was never quiet. Mrs. Harling and Nina and Antonia made as much noise as a house full of children, and there was usually somebody at the piano. Julia was the only one who had held down to regular hours of practicing, but they all played. When Frances came home at noon, she played until dinner was ready. When Sally got back from school, she sat down in her hat and coat and drummed the plantation melodies that Negro minstrel troops brought to town. Even Nina played the Swedish wedding march. Mrs. Harling had studied the piano under a good teacher, and somehow she managed to practice every day. I soon learned that if I were sent over on an errand and found Mrs. Harling at the piano, I must sit down and wait quietly until she turned to me. I can see her at this moment, her short, square person planted firmly on the stool, her little fat hands moving quickly and neatly over the keys, her eyes fixed on the music with intelligent concentration.